The schedule, which is printed and available on the table as you go out, I'm changing the lineup. Next week, Carolyn is preaching, and she's got other things she's going to be doing, so I'm going to move what she was going to do next week, and I'm going to do baptismal regeneration on December 16th rather than January 13th. And that may or may not take more than one class. We'll see. Today's class is the question someone asked, because it basically was posed like this, as I recall. Because our loved ones are with the Lord, resting, or however we want to conceptualize that, can I pray to Grandpa like I can to Jesus? And the answer to that question is really going to depend on who you're asking. If you want the answer to be absolutely unequivocally yes, you've asked the wrong person. What I'm getting at is that in the Roman Catholic and in the Anglo-Catholic and Eastern Orthodox faiths, praying to the saints is normal. You can do that. Why wouldn't you do that?
Well, you have specific saints you buy and stuff.
Right, and you have got specific saints. My tradition is, where I'm coming from in terms of Anglicanism, is what we would call low church, which is more fully just centered in Jesus, the gospel, and the evangelicals, our attitude is, well, even if you can pray to the saints, why would you when you can go right to the boss? So one level, that's where I'm coming from. So I just wanted to give you that. I'm going to try, give that sort of disclaimer up front. I'm going to try as best I can to acknowledge how perhaps Roman Catholics and Anglo-Catholics come to the position of, yes, you can and even should pray to the saints. And when I use the word saints, I'm using it in the New Testament sense of Christian. Okay, so that brings Grandpa into the picture. So when I say saints, don't think of just St. Paul and St. Mary and whoever else you can think of. So the other thing to say about where I'm coming from and where I've been in the Episcopal Church, I grew up in the renewal movement, and in the renewal movement there was a very, I think, legitimate concern of getting involved and wrapped up in spiritism and trying to communicate with the dead through some sort of intermediary, which the Bible is quite clear, actually unequivocally clear, you don't do that. That is a no-no. And I'll get to that more as we go. Now, having said all that, the first thing I think is important, now that I've been a priest for 25 years, I realize that it's important to acknowledge death and grief and loss, so that when the subject matter is, can I pray to Grandpa, to be aware that questions like that often arise out of deep grief and loss, and in my case, I would try to refrain or restrain my answer to not be judgmental in the sense of just coming out with no, but to say more, ask you. What I would do is I would ask the person, well, tell me more, what are you talking about, what's going on? And it may very well be that it's a situation where the person is just still talking to Grandpa as if Grandpa was still in the room. And I think that that's a very different scenario than what Scripture tells us, for example, not to do, which is, don't go to your neighborhood psychic and try to get in touch with Grandpa. We know, right, that it's important to acknowledge grief. I mean, has anyone not ever seen a cross at the side of a road? Okay. I mean, everyone's seen them. We know that where that comes from, that it's coming from deep grief. And it's not just loss of people in our immediate network of relationships. It can be people we don't even know. Flowers that were dumped at Buckingham Palace after the death of Princess Diana is one example. Going way, way back, when I lived in LA, I lived in a part of LA that was very near where Nicole Simpson had lived, and flowers were constantly being left at the driveway of Nicole Simpson. If those of you who don't remember her, she was allegedly murdered by O.J. Simpson. Then there is the memorial at the 911 site in New York, in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, also. The word bereavement, could we shut that door? Thank you. The word bereavement comes from a word reeve, which means ravage, rob, leave desolate. Now, people can go through bereavement in all kinds of ways. When I talk about grief, when I've talked about it, I usually say there are only two ways to grieve: fast and hard or slow and hard. Either way, it's hard. And people grieve at different times and in different ways. And grief can come on us and take us completely by surprise. On the day of 9/11, I'm sure everyone remembers where they were. When I got home, at that point, I was in a one-bedroom apartment, and Carolyn was still Vice President for Mission and Ethics at St. John's Mercy Hospital in St. Louis. And so I was all alone. I remember being in the kitchen. I was just cleaning up after my own dinner, and I just suddenly started to weep. And it just came over me. And it was over the loss of that sense of violation that all Americans felt. And I remember, as I was feeling it, also being taken completely by surprise and almost had this sort of out-of-body experience, sort of looking at myself thinking, that is very weird what you're feeling. You don't even know these people. I'm an American, but I didn't lose anybody at 9/11, but nevertheless, I was filled with grief. I had two cats that each of them lived 17 years, and one was Tasha and one was Tabitha. Tasha I got when I was in seminary, and when she died, I had a picture of her that I propped up on my dresser. Carolyn, one point, referred to it as Tasha's shrine, and I was taken aback by that, and I thought, I don't use shrines. That's an Anglo-Catholic thing. I don't do shrines. But then I had to realize that's exactly what it was, that it was a shrine. It was my way of dealing with the grief that I was going through.
Was it a shrine because it was up where you could see it as opposed to in a book where you can occasionally go?
It was out where every time I was at my dresser, I could see it.
So, okay, because it's locational and not just having it at
No, I didn't carry it with me everywhere I went, no.
Oh, no, I don't mean like you have it in a photo album as opposed to on your dresser.
Right, well now it's in a photo album. Now it's in a dresser drawer or something. I don't remember how long I had the shrine out. It was several months, but I was very taken aback. I was very taken aback by that grief also. The veterinarian invited me to come in to the room when he put her down. He actually gave me the choice, and I wrongly chose to go into the room. That was a big mistake. And when he injected her and she was gone, I just lost it. Just absolutely lost it. Filled with grief. Now the thing is, though, that grief is normal, grief is healthy, and it must not be rushed or resisted. However, people can get stuck in their grief, or at the very least, the adjustment to accepting the finality can take an extremely long period of time. Christians need to be sensitive to that, and I think not be too quick to demolish such feelings in a haste to defend the faith. Which brings us back to our question. The point is that our feelings for the dead are wrapped up in our feelings of grief, and that, I think, in large part accounts for the desire of the living to sustain a relationship with the dead. Now, the very fact that we treasure the memory of our loved ones means that in some way we are still saying to them, I love you. So let's just be honest with ourselves right now that expression of grief is in a way a communication, an attempt to reach out to the dead, to say that I love you. So, that said, I think we need to examine carefully if there are any relationships between the living and the dead which the Bible allows. And Carolyn was very gracious to bring this handout that I went through the trouble of doing and then forgot and left it at home. The first thing I want to say is that... Yes, thank you very much. The state of the dead. Now, I'm not going to go into detail. I've talked about some of this before in a previous class. In 1 Thessalonians, on page 1 there at the top, 4:13 to 14. And now, dear brothers and sisters, we want you to know that what will happen to the believers who have fallen asleep. I put that in brackets there because this particular translation put the word died in there, but the Greek is fallen asleep. So you will not grieve like people who have no hope, for since we believe that Jesus died and was raised to life again, we also believe that when Jesus returns, God will bring with him the believers who have died. The purpose of the metaphor of sleep, I think, is to say that the individual has not ceased to exist. For them, life goes on even if we can't relate to them as we would to a normal waking person. Now, at this point, I should commend to you a book that I'm relying on a lot for this class, called Requiem Healing. Requiem Healing. I don't know if it's still in print. It's written by Michael Mitten and Russ Parker. They're both Anglican clergy, English Anglican clergy. They wrote that they sleep only insofar as we perceive their state of existence. But this does not mean that for them they are not awake to the realities of being in God's presence. Now, I said something similar to that in the class on the creeds in saying that I think there's certainly biblical reason to believe that the dead are aware of being with God. They're aware of being in His presence. How aware, I can't say. But it does seem clear that they are aware of something. The second thing is there is imagery in the Bible suggesting an ongoing and developing relationship with God after death. A very interesting study would be, and I would commend this to you, to look at John 14:2. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? You know how I often say, if we're going to understand the Bible, we've got to go back into the first century and try as best we can to get into the mindset. The many rooms that Jesus is referring to is best understood as a rest station on a highway. Archbishop William Temple wrote about this verse that the Greek is a wayside, and I don't even know if I can pronounce this.
No, just make it, we'll pretend.
Yeah, it's caravan. That's all one word. And what William Temple said is that it's sort of a motel for camel caravans. At night, after the animals were secured, there would be a sort of friendly, party-like atmosphere. And it really makes sense. I mean, traveling in those days was really dangerous. Anyone who was out traveling was all too aware of how dangerous it is. And so when you meet at one of these places, whether they're part of your caravan or not, you know, you're all glad to be safe. You're all glad to be somewhere where you can spend the night in safety. Now, these travelers, what they would do is they would send ahead a dagoman, D-A-G-O-M-A-N, to prepare for the arrival of the caravan. So William Temple is saying that, first of all, this many rooms thing is not the final destination. Okay? It is simply a waypoint, and that follows with what I've been saying in other classes. It involves fellowship with other Christians, and certainly with Christ. It is a stage on the journey. And Mitten and Parker, in their book, say it's quite possible that this time with Jesus before the resurrection involves being in the Father's presence, resting where we are refreshed and renewed in our fellowship life. So the question then for us is then whether or not this is purgatory, and no, the answer is no. This is not purgatory. But the other question is, do the dead, by virtue of their now resting in God's presence, means that they grow and progress in their maturity and faith?
I would think so.
Well, you'd be in good company. The Book of Common Prayer, I think this is in your handout. Right, I'm still on page 1. It's interestingly only in Rite 1. This is not in Rite 2. In the Burial of the Dead, Rite 1, the portion of the service that occurs at the cemetery or wherever the person is being buried, that's called the committal. And this prayer is found, and it's only in Rite 1. Almighty God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, who by a voice from heaven didst proclaim, Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. Multiply, we beseech thee, to those who rest in Jesus, the manifold blessings of thy love, that the good work which thou didst begin in them may be made perfect unto the day of Jesus Christ. And of thy mercy, O Heavenly Father, grant that we who now serve thee on earth may at last together with them be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light. So that phrase, being made perfect, it doesn't suggest, it outright says that people are growing in their relationship. Now, that follows what I understand to be a line of classic Christian thought that says, yes, the dead are with the Lord, and yes, they are having fellowship with Him, and yes, by virtue of that fact, are growing. How could they not be? So, this relationship of the dead also seems to include the sharing of hurt and longing. Revelation 6, 9-11, still on page 1. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slaughtered for the word of God and for the testimony they had given. They cried out with a loud voice, "Sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long will it be before you judge and avenge our blood on the inhabitants of the earth?" They were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer. Now, granted, it's poetic and it's apocalyptic, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. That this is not I don't think at one level intended to be a literal description of things in heaven, but it certainly suggests the possibility that those who die in the faith of Christ go on developing in their faith and perhaps are also aware of events here somehow. And again, there's a line in classic Christian thought that would say, well, yes. I mean, what I'm trying to paint for you is how Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and Anglo-Catholics get to the point where they answer our question with, yes, you can pray to Grandpa. Yes, you can pray to the saints. Now, the question now then, is there a legitimate way in which the living and the dead can either relate to or affect each other? Which brings me back to a point that I'll make again as strongly as I can. The Bible forbids, absolutely forbids, contacting the dead through a spiritualist, through witchcraft, through a medium, anything like that. Deuteronomy 18:10-12. No one shall be found among you who makes a son or daughter pass through fire, or who practices divination, or is a soothsayer, or an augur, or a sorcerer, or one who casts spells, or consults ghosts or spirits, or seeks oracles from the dead. For whoever does these things is abhorrent to the Lord. It is because of such abhorrent practices that the Lord your God is driving them out before you. You must remain completely loyal to the Lord your God. I wanted to include that last bit because it seems that the reason God's saying don't do this is that doing so is disloyal. It is a sign of utter lack of faith in God and needing to push God aside and go some other route, in this case to talk with the dead. I'm going to make sure I don't lose my place here. Okay. There's also a passage in here from Galatians 20, and I forgot to use the citation just after the Deuteronomy passage. It's Galatians 5:20. Now the works of the flesh are obvious: fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions, factions, etc., etc. Interesting that sorcery is in this whole long list of things that are all spoken in the same breath. So don't do it, huh?
Reality television.
Right, yeah. Now, go ahead.
I was going to ask a question then. What would you say is the difference then between divination and prophecy? Is it just, in one case the answer is sort of being presented to you, or seeking them?
Having never gone to a psychic to figure out where they're getting their information from, the thing about sorcery and mediums and all of that kind of stuff, it's not prophecy in the sense that they're not speaking for God. Prophecy in the Bible it can involve foretelling, but it's really forthtelling. Speaking for God. God is, thus saith the Lord. And everything that follows is not me, it's God. That is, in the Bible, clearly the Old Testament is a gift from God. In the New Testament, Paul lists it among the gifts of the Spirit. So we're not talking about someone who is using some sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Witchcraft and that kind of thing. It's like they try to manipulate the spiritual world using right phrases or ingredients or special things like that, And you're not going to see a prophet of the one true God saying, first let me go get my lucky dice before I talk to you. So maybe that helps. Okay. Now, the story of the raising of Lazarus is sometimes used to bolster the prohibition about speaking to the dead. I'm sorry, not the raising of Lazarus, I'm sorry. The story of the rich man and Lazarus. The parable that Jesus told is sometimes used to bolster the prohibition about contacting the dead. It's a parable, and I think along the lines of Revelation needs to be first taken that way as it's not intended to be a literal description of the way things are in terms of heaven and earth, in terms of a gulf separating the two of us. Be that as it may, we can conclude with all confidence that the active seeking to establish contact with the dead is forbidden. But that doesn't mean that we're supposed to work hard at forgetting someone. Nor does it mean that expressions of grief and love in the form of talking to the dead is some sort of unforgivable sin. I mean, I can imagine, I tremble at the thought that Carolyn dies and, now I'm in the kitchen doing the dishes and I just start talking to her. I'm not trying to communicate with the dead. It's an expression of my grief. It's an expression of trying to work through that. Now, hopefully, I get to a point where I don't do that anymore. But if that then leads to, all right, I'm going to look up in the phone book for the local psychic and see if I can't contact her, now I've crossed the line, in my opinion. The loss of someone very, very close to us, I think the analogy is quite apropos. It's like losing a limb. And when you lose a limb, you still feel it's there. And it takes a long time for the body, for the brain, to come to terms with the fact that a portion of the body is no longer there. So let's move on then to biblical records of contact between the living and the dead. Perhaps the biggest one is 1 Samuel 28, verses 3 to 25. King Saul is king of Israel. His prophet Samuel had died, so he was without a prophet. Saul had previously made an edict forbidding, punishable by death, contacting a medium to try to communicate with the dead. But now he's up against the Philistine army, and he's desperate. He's desperate for a word from the Lord. And so he disguises himself, because he's given this edict that you can't go consult mediums over punishment of death. So he disguises himself, goes to the medium at Endor, and asks her to bring Samuel back. Now here's the thing about this. When I was growing up, I was taught that if we have contact with the dead or someone's spirit sort of shows up, that's really not the person's spirit, that's demonic. That's a demon impersonating that person. And that may very well be, and I think and probably 99.999 times out of 100, whatever, that's what's going on. But I don't think that's what's going on here. It seems to be, for reasons that God doesn't make entirely clear, that he allowed Samuel to show up. But it was no approval of the method. It was no approval whatsoever. And the message was, you're going to die, Saul, and your family are going to die. That's the brief version of Samuel. Another example is in Luke and Matthew and Mark. The Transfiguration. I'll only highlight it, that it is Jesus takes Peter, who else did he take? James and John were there? Yeah, Peter, James, and John. And goes up a mountain somewhere. And Moses and Elijah show up. And Jesus is transfigured. Peter sees the whole thing and is so convinced that he's looking at something real that his response is, well, let's build a shelter for everyone to have some protection. So something happened. It was a moment of a sovereign act of God. Jesus didn't go looking for it. Jesus didn't consult anyone to make it happen. I'm not even sure that Jesus knew it was going to happen. We can conclude at this point that the only meetings between the living and the dead that are allowable are those that are sanctioned by God. Samuel being the first example and Transfiguration being the other. Moving on in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, verse 1, and then again later in 22 to 24, the writer of Hebrews speaks of a cloud of witnesses. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us. And then he goes on, you have not come to something that can be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest and the sound of the trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that not another word be spoken to them, for they could not endure the order that was given. If even an animal touches the mountain, it shall be stoned to death. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I trembled with fear. Of course, all of that is about the Israelites camped out at Mount Sinai. And there were theophanies. Theophanies is a big theological word for God shows up and there's no doubt that it's God, even though you don't see him physically. So the writer goes on, you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks of a better word than the blood of Abel. So there are the cloud of witnesses, being the spirits of the righteous, those who die in Christ. So we're not alone. It's from texts like these that the Anglican and Roman Catholic liturgies speak of worshiping with the gathered company of the saints. And let me just say at this point that although I started this by saying I'm an evangelical, I'm a low church, and I don't see what the point of praying to saints, what the point is when you can go right to the source, and I do believe that. At the same time, I've come to appreciate the fact that when we're celebrating the Eucharist, we are in this weird moment in liturgy where time has suddenly stretched out, reaching back and reaching forward. And listen to it. You can hear the overtones in Eucharist of the connection between us and who are at this altar today and those who have gone before us. And you can also hear the hope of what's coming and the hope that we will be reunited with the saints in heaven. And so there is this powerful image that I've come to appreciate since God seems to continually put me in Anglo-Catholic churches, or at least have a history of Anglo-Catholicism, that I've really come to appreciate what is called the communion of saints. That we are not alone. That doesn't mean we can communicate with them, but we are indeed not alone. So we're forced to deal with the paradox of, on the one hand, not to seek communion with the dead, and on the other hand, as I've noted several times in the last few years, that heaven and earth intersect and overlap, and in some way, shape, or form, that doesn't necessarily only include connecting with God. Maybe it does in some way include connecting with the communion of saints. I don't know. As for me, I continue to pray to Jesus. There isn't anything in my piety, in my prayer life, that helps me by praying to an intermediary. Now, the other thing I would say to that historically, I believe that the notion of needing to pray through a saint comes from an era where if you were the average person on the street, you had zero chance of an audience with the emperor or any other leader, really, for that matter. The only thing you could hope for is if you had an inside man. And you can maybe get word to someone who would then get word to that person, who might get word to the other person who's in the court, who might then be able to talk to the emperor. And I think that that's where this is stemming from, in my opinion. I think there were others that might argue vehemently against that, but I have a hard time, given the scriptural witness. Take Hebrews, for example, the book of Hebrews. I mean, by the time you're done reading that book, you're like, we're right in there, the Holy of Holies, for crying out loud. The curtain of the temple's been torn in two. Why do I need to talk to anybody other than Jesus? So, but that's me. That's me. So to bring it back to full circle, it's important that we have a sense of why there might be a need to communicate with Grandpa. Is it grief? Is it something else? Is it leading to something that could become spiritually unhealthy? Now, the other thing I want to say about all of this is that in the Anglican world, it includes the Episcopal Church, you look at the prayer book. If you look at what used to be called Lesser Feasts and Fasts, now it's called Holy Women, Holy Men, which is a book of they're not all saints in my opinion, and some of them don't even belong in there, but that's another story. But they are people whose lives are deemed worthy for us to pay attention to. All of the prayers are to God. They are never to a saint. It is prayer to God about the life of the saint. I mean, usually the prayer is something along the lines of, thank you, Lord, for St. Peter and for his life, and may, his example influence me too and help me become a better Christian. I mean, that's essentially what those prayers are saying. They are always to God. Which leads me then to say this, that strictly speaking, I believe that prayer is an act of worship. And worship belongs to God alone. Prayer is an act of worship. I mean, what do we do every week? It's filled with prayers. It's just one long prayer. It's an act of worship. And so, talking to Grandpa is one thing. Praying to Grandpa is another thing entirely. I suppose if it mattered to someone, if it helped them in some way, I could say, well, you might say, Jesus, would you pass a message along? I think that would be okay. If God wills it, I suppose that God could send a loved one to visit us. It's happened before. The Transfiguration being the big example. There's also, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it, it's only in Matthew, after Jesus' crucifixion, the temple shook, the ground shook, the temple curtain was torn in two, and many of the holy dead were raised, and they visited people in Jerusalem. And what I mean about not knowing what to make of that is it isn't a description of spiritual visits. It's a description of resurrected bodies. That the dead were raised, and these embodied people came and visited people in Jerusalem. And I don't know what to make of that. It's only in Matthew. In that sense, it's a bit obscure, and I don't want to even try to attempt to develop a theology around a single verse like that.
Does it anywhere explain what happens to those bodies after?
Nope. Nope. No explanation. The assumption is
Well, the word visit means they don't.
that they didn't say, right? And where did they go? They went with the Lord. Okay. All right. At this point, I think I'm looking at my other notes, and I've already mentioned all that. You know, the liturgy shapes our belief, in my opinion, or at least that it can have the potential of shaping our belief. And if that's true, then our liturgy is designed to shape our communication to God, to shape it in such a way that it's directed to God and not to anywhere else or anyone else. Questions?
After the grief and short of going psychic, could there be a piece that, a reason why somebody might do that, which is they're familiar with the person that died. They think it might be a way to, communicate more easily with somebody that's with Jesus or in heaven, and they might do it for that reason. Maybe they don't find, even Jesus, approachable in terms of, you'd know what your grandfather might say, right, in response, or you know how you communicate with your grandfather. So I'm wondering if there's a piece there that sort of allows them a route to that world that's familiar.
If I understand what you're getting at, well, let me put it this way. Are we talking about someone who just is continually talking to Grandpa, or now wants to actually hear back from Grandpa?
No, I don't pray to my grandfather, so I don't know. But I'm just thinking that maybe there's sort of you could see a purpose or a reason or where it's not the grief component and it's not going over psychic, but that you're familiar with your grandfather, you're familiar with your loved ones, so I think you can communicate to that world, in a comfortable sort of familiar way.
Well, I guess my knee-jerk reaction or knee-jerk answer to that is to hearken back to Deuteronomy and ask why. If we're not talking about grief and we're really only talking about familiarity, it seems that it's disloyal, if you will. There's something about trying to communicate with the dead. What?
No, I was just going to hop in and say that perhaps part of that goes back to what you were just saying about praying, shaping, believing.
Yep.
What I'm getting at is the scenario that Tom is describing, someone does not have a relationship with Jesus. And there are many Christians who can go to their deathbed not really having a relationship with Jesus. They have a relationship with the church, they have a relationship with their priest, they have relationships with a variety of things, but not with Jesus. And so in that scenario, it might be to that person that praying to grandpa seems more approachable because they know grandpa, but in the end, such prayers are shaping believing, and it's just keeping the person in in that cyclical relationship where Jesus is always on the outside, and any other means for my prayer life becomes the center of my prayer life.
Right, right.
And in that sense, it goes back, I think, to what you were saying, that praying does shape believing. And so if I pray to the curtain, you now know what's at the center of my life. If I pray to Jesus, it's a different statement about who's at the center of my life.
Right, right. That's a very helpful, very good point. And the Anglo-Catholic, Catholic, Orthodox traditions, I think the answer would be there's nothing wrong with what you just described. They're part of the communion of saints, and so pray to them. But I think Carolyn's also pointed out something too, that kind of prayer obviously shapes or can shape our belief. Yeah, Ellie.
I'm reminded of something I heard about 15 years ago at my former church. It was a talk about grief, and it was by a psychologist. Now, I don't really know if he was a Christian or if he was secular. I don't know what the psychologists are. But what he said was, in grief, as it proceeds, that it's okay to develop a relationship with the departed. Now, I never heard, I wasn't sure. And your talking reminded me of that. And do you have any comments? I wonder if it's still biblical or not.
Well, I'm interested by the phrase "develop a relationship with the dead," as opposed to acknowledging a relationship that already existed and now is gone. And I would say, from just I'm not a grief expert, but in my experience, that it's important to give people permission to grieve, and that may include trying to talk to our loved one. I'm not saying go to the local psychic, but I'm saying acknowledging the relationship, acknowledging your love for this person. And in our grief, that can take the form of talking or even praying to our dead loved one. As long as we're not, developing a relationship, that for me, that's not a word I would want to use. I would not want to encourage that, because it might lead down a slippery slope.
It sounds like there's a need to grieve for somebody that you're not inclined to grieve for, and that you have to straighten out that relationship, even though the person's gone, like an abusive parent or
Well, yeah, and that, yeah.
You still need to grieve. If you're not really sorry and you don't really want to grieve.
Right. But let's be clear about something that this might not have been your main point, but it's something I heard. Someone dies who's close to us who is abusive. And we're grieving, but what we're really doing is we're just pissed as hell, okay? That is not a warrant for communicating with the dead. That is a sign of a need for inner healing. That is something for Jesus to deal with and heal those emotions. And believe you me, He can. He can do that. And I've seen it. I've seen it done. Yeah.
I was just going to say that I too have the same problem with the phrase that the psychologist used. On the other hand, it was not until the 1928 prayer book that in the Episcopal Church, we included prayers for the dead in the prayers of the people. And that came in the form of the old form of prayers that are in Rite 1. Now what I'm leading up to is this. My mother died in 1985, and we had your classic adult daughter-mother relationship, which meant, yes, you got it, we drove each other nuts. After she died, I used the petition for the dead as an opportunity to pray for her, to God, not to her, but to God. And I would simply mention her. And the truth of the matter is, what you just said, Jesus came through all of that and healed a relationship in a way that my sister, who never goes to church, doesn't have her relationship. But I'm at peace with my mother, love her dearly, can see what she was up to. All those years she drove me crazy. But the point is, it was not praying to my mother, it was praying to God, and Jesus came into the middle of all of that and was able to put his hand on it. And that is not, I think I understand the phrase the psychologist was using, but in a Christian setting, it's not exactly that. It's letting God be God.
Right, right.
So perhaps what you did was allow God to show you what your mother meant
There you go.
as you were growing up.
I allowed
You
him
didn't understand it.
Right, I allowed him to do it.
Yeah, and that's a really, I can still remember Carolyn praying for Bernice. And I don't know exactly when it stopped, but it was a few years after we were married, she was praying for Bernice, and then one day it stopped. And I didn't notice it until like months and months and months later. She's not praying for Bernice anymore. And that's because she was healed. Yeah.
One of the things we were taught in the School of Healing Prayer was that helping to heal
Inner hurts.
hurts, the way to do it really was to look to Jesus and to remember that he is timeless.
Right.
And if you have a situation in the past that really bothered you, that you can pray and you can imagine that Jesus was back there then, and that you can still
Right.
ask him to heal that situation, even though it's a long time ago.
Right, and that's classic inner healing, where you're inviting Jesus to bring to the fore a memory of pain, a specific incidents, and then asking the person who's experienced the pain to, I mean, in one sense, it's sort of instructing the person to sort of freeze frame it and then look around and where's Jesus and what is he doing? Because he's there, and just keep praying until Jesus reveals where he is and what he's doing. And you know, lots of powerful stories about that, and how Jesus has. It's not about changing history, you know. Jesus is eternal, but history's history. But it is about healing our memories so that when they come back, they no longer flood us. And I'll leave on that note. I'll just leave for your prayerful meditation that last section in John's Gospel where Jesus comes to Peter after his resurrection and asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me?" And John makes a point of saying that this all happened around a charcoal fire for breakfast. Well, if you go back to Peter's denial of Jesus, it was done at a charcoal fire. So what happens when you have an odor, you know, all of a sudden you smell something and these memories come flooding back. You ever have that? I mean, it's very common. Well, that's what's going on. Jesus is healing that so that Peter isn't going to, every time he's by a charcoal fire, is not going to be just racked with grief at how he denied his Lord. All right, 5 after. Next week, baptismal regeneration.
It doesn't happen.